Amina Osei had 6 years of steady hands and a baby due in 9 weeks. And none of it mattered to the man who shoved her into the nurse's station hard enough to knock the clipboard from her grip. She had never once, in 6 years on that floor, raised her voice at a patient, a family member, or a colleague, no matter how bad the shift got. And none of that mattered either in the 3 seconds it took Dalton Vreeland to decide otherwise. What he had no way of knowing was that the woman he'd just had fired was about to be defended by one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the country, her own brother. "Do you know who I am?" Dalton Vreeland's voice cracked across the ICU. "I donated $4 million to this building. I'll have your badge pulled before your shift ends." Amina stood in the ICU hallway in pale blue scrubs, one hand braced against the nurse's station counter, the other pressed instinctively over the curve of her stomach. To understand why a federal prosecutor would drop everything the moment his sister's name lit up his phone, we have to go back 6 years to a promise she'd once asked him to keep. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now let's begin. The ICU at Crestview Medical Center in Seattle never fully quieted, monitors keeping their steady rhythm through every hour of the day, the air carrying that particular hospital mix of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Rain streaked the windows at the end of the hallway most afternoons. That time of year, the gray Puget Sound light filtering in flat and constant, the kind of weather Seattle nurses stopped noticing after their first winter on the job, the low clouds pressing down over the water just visible from the higher floors on a clear day, though clear days were rare enough that nobody bothered checking anymore. Amina had worked that floor for 6 years, the nurse the younger staff called, when a vein collapsed, when a family broke down in the hallway, when a patient crashed at 3 in the morning, and nobody else quite knew what to do first, the kind of steadiness junior nurses learned to imitate before they even fully understood why it worked. She was 7 months pregnant, her feet aching by hour 4 of every 12-hour shift, a dull grinding ache low in her back she never mentioned to anyone. She rubbed her belly once between rooms, took a slow breath, and kept moving. Nobody on that floor knew much about her life outside the hospital. She didn't talk about where she'd grown up, didn't mention family, and when people asked, she smiled and changed the subject. Nobody knew that the quiet nurse adjusting in 4-line in room 6 was the younger sister of Kwame Osei, a senior federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice's Fraud Division, a man whose name showed up in trade press far more often than in casual conversation, precisely because he preferred it that way. He'd kept that distance for her sake, not his own, ever since she'd asked him plainly. Years earlier, sitting across from him at a diner the week she started nursing school, to let her be normal, to let her build something that was only hers, something nobody would ever attribute to his name instead of her own work, a request he'd honored so completely that even his closest colleagues had no idea he had a sister working nights in a Seattle ICU. 2 weeks before, that Tuesday, a different donor's wife had complained loudly at the nurse's station about wait times in the cafeteria, and hospital administration had sent a formal memo reminding staff to prioritize the comfort of major contributors whenever reasonably possible, a memo that had circulated through every department's shared inbox and prompted more than one eye roll exchanged quietly between coworkers who knew exactly what it really meant in practice. Amina had read it twice, with a quiet, uneasy feeling she hadn't been able to name at the time, but recognized immediately the moment Dalton Vreeland walked through the double doors, the two events connecting in her mind, with an unpleasant, retrospective clarity. 24-year-old Anjali Bose worked the same shift that afternoon, 6 months into her first nursing job, still learning the floor's particular rhythms and the unwritten rules nobody bothered writing down, the kind of things you only learn by watching someone else make a mistake first. She'd noticed, in her short time there, how differently the unit treated anyone connected to hospital donors, a quieter voice, a faster yes, an unspoken understanding that certain names carried weight the org chart never officially recognized. She'd wondered privately whether that was simply how hospitals worked everywhere, or something specific to Crestview, and she'd never quite worked up the nerve to ask anyone directly. The double doors at the end of the hallway swung open hard at 2:14 p.m. Every head on the floor turned. Dalton Vreeland walked through them in a steel gray suit that cost more than most nurses made in 3 months. 44 years old, founder of 3 technology companies, a man who had never once heard the word no, without consequence following shortly after. Behind him, a nervous assistant held a folded cloth against Dalton's palm, a small cut, the kind that needed a bandage rather than an intensive care unit, though Dalton clearly didn't see it that way, his voice already rising, before he'd crossed half the distance to the nurse's station. "I need a doctor now," he said, his voice cutting over the monitors. Not a resident, a real one. A young doctor named Trevor Callahan hurried toward him, hands raised, voice low, trying to explain that this floor handled critical care, that the injury looked minor, that the main emergency room sat 2 floors down and could see him within minutes. Dalton grabbed his coat collar and shoved him sideways hard enough that the whole floor stopped breathing for a second, Trevor's back catching the edge of a supply cart that rattled loudly against the tile. He stepped forward, scanning the rooms for an empty bed, a nurse he could simply command into compliance. Amina stepped out of room 6. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Dalton stopped walking, his jaw tightening, looking at her the way powerful men sometimes look at people they've already decided don't matter, like furniture that had unexpectedly started talking. "Do you know who I am?" His voice dropped into something uglier. "I donated $4 million to this building. I'll have your badge pulled before your shift ends." "That's your right," Amina said, not moving. "But you're still not coming through this hallway." From Anjali's side of the nurse's station, the whole scene had unfolded, with a kind of slow, sickening clarity, watching a colleague she admired stand her ground against a man twice her seniority in every measure that supposedly mattered in that building. She'd thought, in the 4 seconds before anything happened, about stepping forward herself, about saying something that might diffuse it, running through half a dozen possible sentences in her head, and discarding each one before her mouth could actually form it, and had stayed rooted exactly where she was instead, telling herself the situation was Amina's to handle, that a 6-month employee interjecting would only make things worse for everyone. She would spend the following weeks turning that decision over in her mind more times than she could count, at odd moments, driving home, brushing her teeth, wondering whether 4 seconds of hesitation had actually mattered, or whether she was simply looking for something to blame herself for, after the fact. Something shifted in his face, the controlled anger cracking into something colder. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a card holder, and flipped it open toward Trevor, who had pressed himself against the wall. "Write me a number," Dalton said. "Whatever it takes to move one of these patients to another floor. I don't care which one. I need this bed." Trevor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Amina spoke instead. "Put that away," she said, her voice steady. "Money doesn't change which patients are stable enough to be moved. The man in room 4 had open-heart surgery 11 hours ago. He cannot be relocated for a cut on your hand." Dalton turned to her slowly, the card holder still open. "You're a nurse," he said, and the way he said it turned the word into an insult. "You don't make those calls. On this floor, I do." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Dalton launched into it, loud and relentless, calling her incompetent, commenting on her scrubs, her education, her salary, her place, the words coming faster the less reaction he got, as though her calm was itself an offense he needed to correct. He said things that made the younger nurses at the station stare at their shoes in secondhand shame, one of them backing quietly toward the supply closet, as though putting distance between herself and the scene might somehow help. Amina absorbed all of it, without flinching, and turned toward the wall phone to call security. That was when Dalton shoved her, hard, both hands against her shoulder, the force enough to knock the clipboard from her grip and send her stumbling into the edge of the nursing station counter. The sound of the clipboard hitting the floor seemed absurdly loud in the sudden silence, a small plastic clatter that nobody moved to pick up. Her hands flew instinctively to her stomach, both of them wrapping around the curve of it, her eyes closing for one long second that said everything the rest of her body couldn't. She didn't fall, catching herself on the counter edge. But that closed-eyed second stretched out long enough that 3 different nurses would later describe it independently as the moment they knew something in that hallway had broken for good. The floor went silent in the particular way that follows something irreversible. Anjali stood frozen at her station, both hands pressed over her mouth, her body finally reacting a full 2 seconds too late to matter. A security guard near the elevator had his hand on his radio, but hadn't moved. Nobody had moved. Dalton straightened his jacket cuffs, breathing slightly harder than before but otherwise composed, as though he'd simply corrected an inconvenience rather than assaulted a pregnant woman. "Maybe now you understand how this works," he said. Dr. Callahan's supervisor, the unit's chief of medicine, Dr. Everett Marchetti, arrived less than a minute later, 62 years old, silver-haired, a reputation for calm under pressure that he was about to spend entirely in the wrong direction. He surveyed the scene. Amina still steadying herself against the counter, one hand pressed low against her stomach, Dalton standing with his arms crossed, and his composure fully rebuilt, and made his decision in under 3 seconds. "Mr. Vreeland," he said, moving toward Dalton, with his hand extended, his voice smooth. "I'm so sorry for this. Let's get you taken care of immediately." He didn't look at Amina once, not even a glance in her direction, as though acknowledging her might complicate the decision he'd already made. Dalton rolled his shoulders. "Your nurse was aggressive and obstructed patient care," he said. "I defended myself." Dr. Marchetti nodded like he'd been told a reasonable weather report, checking no cameras, asking no witnesses, never once glancing at the mark already forming, where Dalton's hands had connected with her shoulder. He turned to Amina, his voice going flat. "I'm going to have to let you go, effective immediately," he said. "Please surrender your badge and clear your locker." The shock landed somewhere behind her sternum, though it wasn't really the words that hurt. She'd half expected the words the moment Marchetti walked in, without checking on her first. It was the witnesses, the nurses and doctors, who had watched Dalton shove a pregnant woman into a counter and were now studying their own shoes, none of them stepping forward to say what every one of them had plainly seen. 2 security guards walked her out, not roughly, but firmly, like they'd been told to make it look official. She handed over her badge, emptied her locker into a paper bag, and walked down the long corridor past patients she'd cared for, past the break room, where she'd eaten hundreds of lunches, past the room, where she'd once held a dying man's hand, because no family had come in time. The front doors opened, onto a cold, rainy Seattle afternoon. She stood on the wet sidewalk and pulled out her phone. There was already an email waiting from a law firm, notifying her that Dalton Vreeland intended to sue for emotional distress and interference with his care, the message arriving with a speed that made clear how quickly his team had moved before she'd even reached her car. She went home that evening and sat in the dark for a long time, both hands on her stomach, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped, the rain still ticking against her apartment window long after she'd stopped hearing it, as separate from the sound of her own heartbeat, the whole apartment gone quiet except for that steady, insistent patter against the glass. She had built this life, over 6 years, shift by shift, patient by patient, precisely because it was hers and nobody else's. And some part of her resisted, even now, the idea of reaching for the one advantage she'd always refused to use. She picked up her phone anyway and dialed a number she hadn't used in longer than she wanted to admit. Kwame Osei answered on the second ring, already 3 floors deep in a case file, when his sister's name lit up his screen, something he hadn't seen in months. "Amina," he said, his voice immediately sharpening at something in the quiet on the other end. "I need help," she said. That was all. "Tell me what happened," he said, and she did, slowly, the shove, the slur of words, before it, the way Dr. Marchetti had chosen Dalton Vreeland over her in under 3 seconds, without so much as checking a single camera. She could hear him go very still on the other end of the line partway through, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid calculations behind an otherwise calm voice. Kwame was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "Amina," he said finally, his voice careful. Dalton Vreeland's name has been sitting in an open file on my desk for the better part of 8 months. She went still, the phone suddenly heavier against her ear. What kind of file? She asked. Tax fraud, he said. Wire fraud through 2 shell entities tied to his last 2 ventures. We've been building it slowly, waiting on one more piece of corroborating evidence. Before we moved, careful not to tip our hand, before the case was airtight. He paused. What he did to you today isn't part of that case. But it's the reason I'm not waiting anymore. There was, underneath Dalton's cruelty, that afternoon, one detail that complicated him, as a person rather than a villain. 11 years earlier, before any of his companies existed, a hospital in a different city had turned his own father away from a cardiac unit over an insurance technicality, a decision that cost the man his life. Within the week, Dalton sitting in a waiting room the entire time being told, politely and repeatedly, that there was nothing more anyone could do without the right paperwork clearing first. He had spent every year since converting that helplessness into an obsession with never again being the person who had no leverage in a hospital hallway, donating aggressively, loudly, specifically so that no institution could ever again tell him no. Each new wing and each new plaque another brick in a wall he'd built against a feeling he never let himself examine directly. It didn't excuse a single thing he'd done to Amina. It only meant that somewhere underneath the $4 million donation was a man who had turned one unbearable afternoon into a lifelong need for control that had curdled, slowly, into exactly the kind of cruelty his own father's death should have taught him to recognize rather than repeat. Kwame's office moved, within 72 hours, filing an accelerated set of subpoenas against Dalton's holding companies and personal accounts, the kind of paperwork that had already been drafted and simply waiting on final authorization before Amina's phone call turned waiting into urgency. A federal judge granted an emergency asset freeze on 3 accounts tied to what investigators would eventually describe as a decade-long pattern of underreported income and improperly routed venture capital, the freeze landing on Dalton's desk the same week his lawyers were still drafting the emotional distress suit against Amina, the timing itself becoming a small, bitter irony that several business reporters would later note in their coverage. Anjali Bose, still shaken by what she'd watched and unable to stop replaying it in her head every night since, gave a statement to hospital administration a week later confirming exactly what she'd seen, the shove, the mark on Amina's shoulder, Dr. Marchetti's refusal to review the security footage before making his decision, sitting across from the same administrators who had signed off on Amina's termination, without flinching as she read her account aloud, from a page she'd rewritten 4 times the night before. She'd spent that week weighing her own 6 months of tenure against what she knew she'd witnessed, telling herself repeatedly that a junior nurse speaking up against a chief of medicine rarely ended well for the junior nurse, replaying the 4 seconds of hesitation from that afternoon and deciding she wasn't going to let a second round of silence sit on her conscience the same way. Her statement, combined with the unit's own security footage, became the centerpiece of the hospital's internal review, corroborated frame by frame, with a timestamp nobody could dispute. The state medical board opened a separate inquiry into Dr. Marchetti's conduct, examining whether his decision to terminate a nurse without reviewing available evidence constituted a breach of professional standards, particularly given his own testimony that he had prioritized a donor's account of events over an employee's safety without so much as glancing at the footage sitting 2 rooms away. The board suspended his license pending a full hearing, a process that would take the better part of a year to resolve and would end, eventually, in a permanent revocation once the full timeline of the incident became public record, his own written statement to the board citing the donation's importance to the cardiac wing, as though that alone explained away the decision, a justification the hearing panel noted, in its final ruling, explained his motive, without excusing his conduct. Dalton Vreeland was indicted on federal charges of wire fraud and tax evasion. Within a month, the assault allegation filed separately by the county prosecutor's office once Amina, supported by her brother's office, but represented by outside counsel to avoid any conflict of interest, formally reported the incident, through the appropriate channels rather than anything resembling a favor, insisting from the start that the process follow exactly the same path it would have for anyone else who walked into that precinct with the same complaint. Dalton's own attorneys withdrew the emotional distress suit against her within days of the indictment becoming public, recognizing exactly how it would read alongside federal fraud charges and a documented assault caught on hospital security footage that had already been subpoenaed as evidence in the criminal case. He pleaded guilty 8 months later to reduce his eventual sentence, accepting 5 years in federal prison along with full restitution and forfeiture of the assets investigators traced through his shell entities, standing in a federal courtroom in a plain suit that cost considerably less than the one he'd worn into that ICU hallway, his voice notably smaller than it had been that afternoon when he demanded a doctor for a cut that never needed stitches. A local business reporter who'd covered his rise for nearly a decade noted in her final piece on the case that the same instinct for control that had built his companies had ultimately been the thing that exposed him, since a quieter man might have simply waited 2 floors down for the emergency room like everyone else that day. Crestview Medical Center reinstated Amina with full back pay and issued a formal written apology, along with a new policy requiring any termination involving a documented physical incident to be reviewed by an independent panel rather than a single administrator, a change hospital staff quietly credited to Anjali's willingness to speak up when it would have been easier not to. The hospital also implemented mandatory training on workplace violence protocols for healthcare staff, drawing on federal occupational safety guidelines that had existed for years but had never been meaningfully enforced at Crestview until a pregnant nurse's shoulder made the gap impossible to ignore any longer. The new curriculum rolled out to every department within the same quarter rather than delayed the way such initiatives so often were. Amina gave birth 8 weeks later in the same hospital, on the same floor she'd once been walked out of in the rain, her daughter arriving with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that announced her presence to half the maternity wing. The room was quiet and warm that morning, flowers already arriving, from co-workers who hadn't known what to say the day she was fired, but knew exactly what to say now. Kwame visited that same afternoon, still in his work suit, standing quietly near the door, with his hands folded, watching his niece, with an expression Amina had genuinely never seen on his face before, something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with case files or federal statutes. "You good?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her bed. His tie loosened for once, his usual crisp posture softened by whatever he'd left behind at the office to get there that fast. She looked at her daughter, then at him. "Yeah," she said, a small, real, tired laugh slipping out. "I'm good." He nodded once, like that answer settled something he'd been carrying quietly since the phone call 8 months earlier, a weight she hadn't fully realized he'd been holding until she watched it visibly leave his shoulders. Anjali stopped by, that evening on her way off shift, standing awkwardly in the doorway for a moment, before Amina waved her in. Anjali sat beside the bed and looked at the baby for a long moment, her hands twisting slightly in her lap the way they had every time she'd worked up the nerve to say something difficult. Over the past 8 months, the same nervous habit Amina had noticed the very first week Anjali started on the floor. "I almost didn't say anything," she admitted quietly. "I know," Amina said. "Why did you?" "Because staying quiet felt worse than the risk," Anjali said. And Amina reached over and squeezed her hand once, understanding exactly what that sentence had cost her to say out loud. Anjali had, in the months since, become the nurse other new hires quietly sought out when something on the floor felt wrong, a small, unplanned inheritance from an afternoon neither of them would have chosen, but both had walked through anyway. She stayed until the baby fell asleep, then let herself out quietly, leaving Amina alone with her daughter and the particular stillness of a room where, for once, nothing more needed to happen that day. Narrator reflection: the detail I can't stop turning over is the $4 million donation itself, sitting there in Dalton's mouth like a password he genuinely believed would open every door for the rest of his life. OSHA has documented for years how workplace violence against healthcare workers follows a specific, preventable pattern, not random chaos. but a slow institutional habit of prioritizing whoever holds the most visible leverage in the room, whether that's a donor's name or a title on a door. What gets lost in that pattern is the 4 seconds it actually takes someone else in the room to decide whether they'll say what they saw. Anjali didn't stop the shove. Nobody could have, probably, once Dalton had already decided how that afternoon was going to go. But she did eventually say the true thing out loud, on paper, to people who could have simply filed it away the way Dr. Marchetti filed away everything that made his decision inconvenient. I keep thinking about how much of accountability in situations like this doesn't depend on the powerful person changing it all. Dalton never once expressed real remorse, even in that courtroom, but on whether the people standing nearby decide their own silence is worth the cost. So here's what I keep asking. The next time you're standing 2 feet from something wrong and telling yourself it isn't your place to say anything, how long does that reasoning actually hold up once you say it out loud to yourself?